Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to our next Life Sciences session. Welcome to all of you. I'm also very happy to see that so many of you have registered for the session, which for us was perhaps less of a trodden path because it's, as you know, the Belgian medicines reimbursement reform. That's the topic of today, is something that is still out in the open. It's not yet fully implemented. A lot is ongoing. And what we want to do today with you is discuss the draft act or bill, which was the draft law, which was adopted or which was proposed by the ministers and the Council of Ministers. And I think it's important to note here that this draft act is not yet publicly available. So what we actually did is we tried to obtain a copy through a couple of channels and sources, and we eventually obtained a copy, luckily, for today's session, because we had already planned the session prior to obtaining that copy. The thing is, of course, that sometimes these copies are published quite quickly. In this case, that wasn't the case, and otherwise this would have been a different session. Now, many of you will know the roadmap of the National Institute of Health and Disability Insurance, the NIDI, INAMI, RISIF. And based on that roadmap, the draft act has been proposed. It's now with the Council of State for advice, and it will be going to the Parliament as well, where there will be further discussion. But I think it will show you, and that's the purpose of today's session, it will give you already the first flavor of what the emphasis is on, what the further steps also are, and which points of the roadmap have been proposed to be introduced in this act. And that's today's session. Now, and we will discuss that. The aim of the reimbursement reform is that it will enter into force on the 1st of January or early 2025, which means that we still have some time to go. And as a result of that, I also want to highlight already that, of course, we will continue to follow up on this topic, to follow up on the legislative proposal, to follow up on further royal decrees, and to follow up during, for instance, on our pharma law seminar in April, and also in further life sciences sessions and blogs, so that you will continue to be on top of this proposed reform. So let's dive in to this topic after this perhaps a bit elaborate introduction. I'm here together with Bart Bollen, and we will introduce you in this topic. Bart Bollen, my colleague at the IP and Life Sciences Department. So the institutional status of the reimbursement reform, just briefly, there was a policy paper of the Minister of Health in 2021. Stakeholders were consulted, as you will know. There was a report on the consultation process, and then subsequently, there was a proposal for a roadmap, and following that proposal, the Council of Ministers approved 2 bills. That was in January 2024, and I think it was a couple of days after that, or a week after that, that we listed this session. At that point, as I said before, we didn't have a copy of the bills. But the request for advice was, as usually the case, asked to the Data Protection Authority, and through that channel, we obtained a copy of the bill. After the session, you will receive a copy of the slides, and you will also receive a copy of the bill, which I hope for those of you who want to read it will also be helpful. Next steps, as I said, advice of the Council of State and the parliamentary process, and then afterwards also implementing royal decrees. So today's session, the main focus is, as I said, this bill, and particularly then the amendments that it will bring to the Health Insurance Act, the Act of 14 July 1994, which many of you will know. And the core of this bill is in Title II in that respect. So the topics that we will discuss is just very briefly some clarifications and practical issues in respect of this bill. And then I think the 4 main topics, the reimbursement procedures for which scientific support will be optimized and professionalized, the reimbursement commission, which is modernized, also including its procedures, also including patient engagement or engagement of patient organizations. Then a new route, and I think that's perhaps the essence of today's session: early and fast equitable access for promising medicines. And then finally, the reform of managed entry agreements. The first three topics and the last topic will be presented by Bart, and I will take care of the early and fast equitable access. And I therefore gladly leave the floor to Bart.
Thank you, Kirian. Good afternoon from my side as well. My name is Bart. I'm an associate in the IP and Life Sciences department here at Altius, and I will be guiding you through some of the topics of the bill. I suggest we start right off the bat with some clarifications and practical issues. That's also important. A very simple clarification that will be made is the new Article 2Y to the Health Insurance Act, which will now also include an express definition of the term reference specialty, with which you are all well known. I'm not telling you anything new here because it's actually just a simple copy of Article 135 of the Royal Decree of the 1st of February 2018, which is one of the implementing acts regarding reimbursement procedure. Another clarification is that Article 25 of the draft bill will add a new third indent to Article 34, first paragraph, fifth indent of the Health Insurance Act, which means that biosimilars are now also expressly included in the list of medical services for which the health insurance in Belgium may intervene. Reference is made to biological equivalents of biological proprietary medicinal products, so biosimilars. This is a has the quasi-same scope as the current Article 1, 20th indent of the Royal Decree of the 1st of February 2018, which misses the reference to the EU directive, but since EU directives are implemented in national law, that is not really of particular relevance in our point of view. A very important practical issue is the entry into force of the draft bill after it has been adopted, of course. This has been regulated in Article 30, which is a self-standing provision of the bill, so it doesn't change any provisions of the Health Insurance Act. So the envisaged entry into force will be on the 1st of January 2025, as Kirian already mentioned. However, the Article 30 of the draft bill says that an earlier entry into force of specific provisions is possible, but must be regulated by a separate royal decree. And also the king can, or the government can adopt transitional rules regarding the entry into force of the draft bill, but that also has to be done by royal decree. That brings us to our second topic of today, which is the optimization and further professionalization of support for reimbursement procedures. First subtopic is about added therapeutic value. You will find that in Article 26 of the draft bill, which amends Article 35 bis, paragraph 2 and paragraph 2 bis of the Health Insurance Act. So currently there is a system of three added value classes. Class 1, which means added therapeutic value of a medicine over pre-existing alternatives. Class 2, no added therapeutic value over pre-existing alternatives. And Class 3, generics and copies of original specialties. The reform now proposes that there will be more of a focus on the evaluation of added therapeutic value, which will lead to one of three situations. That is a term that is used in the draft bill. The first situation is recognized added therapeutic value. The second one is unrecognized added therapeutic value. And the third one is added therapeutic value to be confirmed or rebutted. This reform will also have an impact on the determination of the reimbursement basis, so it's not just some cosmetic change. In the current system for Class 1, the determination is made based on the proven added therapeutic value of the specialty. And then for Classes 2 and 3, reference is made to the existing therapeutic alternatives. Now, for the future determination of reimbursement basis, if the bill moves beyond Parliament, there will be one type of determination for all specialties, which is the proven added therapeutic value plus potentially other evaluation criteria mentioned in paragraph 2 of Article 35 bis, for example, the significance in medical practice. And one must also look at the cost of existing therapeutic alternatives. Another thing is that the Commission for Reimbursement of Medicines, the CRM, gives a reasoned proposal for reimbursement, and the draft bill says that it will need to take into account additional elements to be determined by royal decree. So there still needs to be an implementing act. What you see on the bottom of the slide is actually the current version of Article 35 bis, paragraph 3 of the Health Insurance Act, and what you see in green is what will be added by the draft bill. And which has been put in green. You see a little brown passage, which we think should be linguistically added to the proposed amendment, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense, linguistically speaking, nor in English nor in Dutch. So we will see if the Council of State in its advice will pick this up. As you know, an expert evaluation and a CRM proposal for reimbursement can be replaced by an administrative procedure, a simplified administrative procedure. Now, in the current system, you have actually 4 possibilities, which you will see on the left side of the table, that will now be reduced to 2, according to the proposed reform. And the 2 situations in which an administrative procedure can be launched are for certain subtypes of applications for the pharmaceutical specialties for which the applicant does not request recognition of added therapeutic value for the relevant indication. These subtypes of application will still need to be determined by royal decree, so we will have to wait for that. And then secondly, there are the technical changes to the reimbursement modalities on the applicant's request, as long as they don't have any influence on the target group and the already reimbursed indications. That is not a new mechanism, that was already there in the current system. Then another subtopic is the changes to the list of reimbursed specialties. So a future royal decree will determine cases in which the needy medical care service may propose changes in the list to the minister. Without CRM intervention in cases of technical correction of errors, the proposal now says that the medical care service can decide the changes instead of just proposing them to the minister, but only when there is no budgetary impact involved. Another subcategory is after CRM advice to increase the coherence between reimbursement modalities of different specialties or making some administrative simplifications. Again, the proposal is to let the medical care service just decide the changes instead of propose the changes to the minister, who will then take the ultimate decision. Again, this is only possible when no budgetary impact is involved, and it doesn't have to happen with CRM advice. The other side of the medal, of course, is if the medical care service will take the decisions instead of just proposing the changes, they will need to keep the CRM informed of any changes they make. Then the last subtopic in this category is also concerns Article 26 of the draft bill, which will amend Article 35 bis, paragraph 9 of the Health Insurance Act. Again, we will have to wait for royal decree, but that future royal decree may establish special procedural rules and deadlines for specialties for which a joint reimbursement process is initiated with one or more particular countries. You will probably know this as the Benelux AIA cooperation, which is a cooperation set up between a few countries, namely Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Austria, and Ireland. And within that framework, there can be joint pricing or reimbursement negotiations based on a joint health technology assessment, but this will be further implemented by a royal decree. We move on to the next topic, which is the modernization of the Reimbursement Commission. A lot has been talked about enhanced participation of patient organizations, which was very relevant for establishing the roadmap. So when we look at the draft bill, what it says about the topic, you will immediately see that Article 12 of the draft bill will amend Article 29 bis of the Health Insurance Act, which introduces patient representation within the Reimbursement Commission. You will see the membership in the scheme that we have included on the slide, which means that the patient or the representatives of the patient organizations will be added to the non-voting members within the Reimbursement Commission. These will likely be one effective member and one replacing member, but this requires a further amendment of Article 122 nonius of the Royal Decree of the 3rd of July 1996, because that Royal Decree actually determines how many members there are per category. The Health Insurance Act just determines who is a part of the Reimbursement Commission. Enhanced participation of patient organizations will also be introduced in the EFEA Advisory Commission, which is a topic that Kirian will talk about in just a few moments. This Advisory Commission already exists. Those provisions are currently contained in Article 25 Octies/1 of the Health Insurance Act, but they will be moved to a self-standing subdivision within the Health Insurance Act. Again, on the slide, you will see the current composition of the EFEA Advisory Commission, and they will be joined by one representative of the patient organizations, also as a non-voting member. There will also be new competences for the Needy's Patient Forum, which is an already existing organ within the Needy, and it gets actually 4 new tasks. First of all, it proposes the representatives of patient organizations within the Reimbursement Commission, which is what we just talked about. They will propose external experts to the Reimbursement Commission in function of the subject that needs to be treated. It will also propose representatives of patient organizations within the Advisory Commission for a temporary reimbursement for the use of a medicine. That's the EFEA Advisory Commission that we also just talked about. And fourthly and lastly, they will coordinate applications of these commissions toward patient organizations and vice versa. The envisaged establishment of a new Patients' Council has not yet included in the bill. As we read the bill, even though it was a discussion point during the stakeholder process and was also included in the roadmap. So we will see if this will still pop up or not. And then I will gladly give the floor to Kirian, who will talk about early and fast equitable access to promising medicines.
Thank you, Bart. I will indeed discuss the early and fast equitable access, EFEA, in abbreviated form. And I'll try to make it a bit, let's say, accessible or easily accessible, easily digestible, also by including some figures which summarize what is actually in the proposal. Because if you will read the proposal, you will see that it is it's a big chunk of text with a lot of cross-references, and in my view, I would respectfully say that it could perhaps have been written more clearly, although of course a royal decree will help us. But what we will also try to do is, by means of the schemes in the next slides, also help you guide through this new system, which I think may play a very important role. As a preliminary remark, the early temporary reimbursement, the ETR, or the so-called cohort procedure, is abolished. And that is actually because since 2016, the INAMI, the Needy, said, well, there are only 3 approved files, so the unmet medical need budget, which actually has been reserved, has barely been used. And as a result of that, we're going to reform it and integrate it in the early and fast equitable access system, and then as early access, because you will see that there is a difference between early access and fast access, both of them supposedly equitable. The dispute resolution clause in respect of cohort decision remains, because of course there can still be disputes regarding these, let's say then, 3 files in the past. Now, this is what the EFEA scheme will look like. So there's the grant procedure or the overall term of EFEA, and that is subdivided by early access meaning before MA grant, and fast access, meaning after MA grant. As I said, the ETR or the cohort procedure has been abolished and is now included in early access. So what is the idea behind EFEA? It's that you get, as a company, get compensation for making your medicine available before marketing authorization or after marketing authorization, but before actual reimbursement. So you will now have, the final step will always remain reimbursement, and none of these two possibilities replaces actual reimbursement, but they're prior systems prior to reimbursement to ensure that you can obtain compensation and that the patient can obtain access to these new and promising medicines. So if we look at early access, as I said before, only for unauthorized medicines, and fast access only for authorized medicines. Now, for early access, the unauthorized medicines need to provide in a so-called unmet medical need. That is, I think, very similar with the cohort procedure. And the unauthorized medicine has to be included in a compassionate use program or a medical need program approved by the Federal Drugs Agency. For fast access, as I said, it's only for authorized medicines. And there are three subcategories. The first one is that of early access. If you have early access prior to MA grant, you will automatically move to fast access after MA grant. So that is, I think, important and can also help to make the system more helpful for all stakeholders involved, for you as company and for patients. And it also is a possibility to include other medicines which were not included in early access, but which were part of the prime scheme of the or eligible for the prime scheme of the European Medicines Agency for priority medicines, or which have been part of an accelerated assessment, subjected to an accelerated assessment by the European Medicines Agency. For these two types of cases, not the early access, but these two last types of cases, you need to apply for fast access, whereas for early access, it's automatic. That's, I think, in a nutshell. And let's then look at these two different systems. So first, early access, this is the procedure. First of all, there is a list of unmet medical needs and the need, of course, or the indication for which your medicine will then be applied for early access, well, that indication needs to be part of the list of unmet medical needs. If your indication is indeed part of the unmet medical needs list, then you can apply for early access. There will be a decision on early access that will result in compensation for early access. And then there is, of course, after, let's say, you obtain marketing authorization grant, or there's something else that happens, there's the question in terms of transition or the end of early access. And these 5 steps I will discuss with you in more detail, starting with the list of unmet medical needs. Unmet medical needs, the procedure to establish unmet medical needs is largely similar to what we have at the present stage already. Applications still need to be introduced before the 15th of May of the preceding year, and then a decision needs to be taken before the 31st of October of the preceding year by the General Council. I've included in blue, or highlighted in blue, what is actually new. So you see that applications can now also be submitted not only by the Minister of Health or Social Affairs or the company involved, but also by other stakeholders. And then the decision by the General Council, that is still the same. It's also still following advice by the Advisory Commission on early access, but no longer advice is required from the College of Physicians Directors. And then I think some difference with what we have now, if your indication is not on the list of unmet medical needs, under the present system, you could still obtain a cohort decision, which needed to be approved by the General Council. In the new system, you need to obtain, if you want early access, you need to obtain or your indication needs to be in the list of unmet medical needs at a later stage, so could be this year, and that needs to be done and approved by the General Council, which means that the entire indication then goes to the unmet medical needs, and then on that basis you will apply for your early access. And this is, of course, and that was in the past as well, exceptionally possible only if your earlier application in the preceding year was not possible before the 15th of May. So that's the first point. Let's look at applications for early access then. How or what do we know in this respect already? Well, an application for early access is not possible if you can apply for fast access or if you can apply for reimbursement. As I said before, it's not instead of one of these other schemes, it's really preceding these other schemes when fast access or reimbursement is not yet possible. And if there is also, if you need to introduce still an application for inclusion in the list of unmet medical needs, as I mentioned before, you can still do that. In that case, you need to, or your application for early access, which you may already have introduced, will be suspended until there is a decision by the General Council on this list of unmet medical needs. If you apply for early access as an applicant, you need to undertake a number of commitments. First of all, you need to successfully complete, whatever that may mean, but I think complete is the better wording. In Dutch, it would say successfully complete, but complete ongoing clinical trials. You need to apply for a marketing authorization within 6 months. So there's a deadline. You apply for early access, and you need to obtain for marketing authorization within 6 months then, which means, of course, that you cannot try to stall your product being included in early access. Now, in the law, I don't see any provision which states that early access would remain or would stop to apply if you would not apply within 6 months. Although I think that should and is the logical conclusion. And the same in respect of fast access, there is a similar commitment that you need to undertake than for reimbursement. And in respect of fast access, there is actually included in the law, or the law actually provides that your fast access would stop automatically if you don't apply for reimbursement. I think this is perhaps something that needs to be fixed, and it would, of course, make sense. You also need to undertake that you communicate the CHMP's advice to the Advisory Commission. You also need to commit that you will apply for reimbursement within 6 months following the marketing authorization grant. So if you apply for marketing authorization within 6 months, then you continue early access, your MA will be granted, but then of course you need to follow up with reimbursement. In the meanwhile, as I said before, your early access would move to fast access, which I will discuss later. You need to ensure that your product is available, and you need to make it available free of charge to the patient. The patient may not pay for it until there is a fast access decision, reimbursement, or until end of treatment. So you have that commitment. Of course, you will get compensation under the early access scheme. And then you also need to collect data according to the use and therapeutic follow-up protocol. You will see in the next slides and a bit later why these data are relevant. These data will then be used as real-world evidence and in terms and for particular purposes, which I will discuss later. And then you also need to use a suitable and validated method to analyze the pseudonymized data of the HCP and the pharmacist, so what the data they collect. And you need to include this in your report to the authorities or in your standard reimbursement application file. So you see a number of commitments as a result of which you will then obtain compensation. The further rules in respect of the application for early access will be determined in a royal decree. You will have seen, by the way, that on the slides we've always highlighted royal decree will determine further rules in a certain, I'd say, brownish, goldish font to make you immediately see which rules still need to be followed up by royal decrees. Then for the next step, after you've applied for early access, the question is, in respect of your decision. The decision here will be by the advisory commission, which has a deadline of 55 working days following having declared your application admissible and excluding suspensions. It can be suspended in the meanwhile. And if it's if a decision has not intervened timely, there is silent approval, so you will be included in the early access scheme. That decision of the advisory commission is limited in time within the boundaries to be set by a royal decree. So it's not infinite. There will still be a time limit, in addition to the fact that you also need to apply for marketing authorization in time. So there are a number of safeguards to avoid that this can continue for too long. And this will be published on the website of the NIDI. The same, by the way, in terms of being limited in time, will also apply to the fast access decision. So again, the royal decree will determine the further rules, which brings me to the compensation for early access. And here, I've clicked a couple of times, so you see that there is a two-tiered compensation scheme. You will first get a fixed compensation for your approved early access file. So you apply for early access for your medicinal product and the indication that is approved, and then you will get a compensation, one fixed amount. It's to be set by royal decree, but presumably what the roadmap says is that it's 25,000 euros. Now at present stage for the cohort, it's 20,000 euros. And the fixed compensation per patient will then come on top of this, again, to be set by royal decree, but presumably the figures in the slides that we've included here. And in this respect, in these figures, you will see that there is a difference if it's an orphan drug or not. If it's an orphan drug, you will get a higher compensation. If it's a biological drug, you will also get a higher compensation per patient. And if it's cell and gene therapy, you will get a relatively high compensation. So these amounts would then be doubled. At least that's what the roadmap says. It's not in the law yet for the first 50 patients. Remains to be seen whether that will be implemented in the royal decree. And there is a safeguard, a caveat by the National Institute that these amounts cannot be considered as indicative for the eventual reimbursement. The same, by the way, applies for the fast access amounts that would be set. You cannot negatively or positively rely on these amounts to then apply for reimbursement basis and the price which would be in line with these amounts. And that brings me to the next point. So as I said, you have already your product is part of this early access scheme. But then, if a prescribing physician has a patient who makes use who uses your product for the listed indication, which is an unmet medical need and which is part of a CUP or an MNP, then the prescribing physician needs to file an application to inform the authorities thereof with some data of the patient, and you will then be compensated from the company will be compensated from the program for early access, and that will come from the unmet medical need budget, which, as I said before, is presently, according to the INAMI, barely used, which, of course, the intention is that it would be used more widely now. Now, the records of these data are to be kept for 3 years by the National Institute, which would be the data controller for the data experts here. And the access to these records are, of course, restricted to the prescribers and members of the advisory commission, the institute, and the patient itself, him or herself. Then the royal decree, again, will determine further rules and amounts for this compensation. Finally, transition or end of early access. And here you see, in terms of transition, of course, if your CUP or MNP results or ends as a result of the marketing authorization grant, then your early access will end, but it will continue until you are included in fast access. You will see when I discuss fast access, it's presently uncertain what the time would be then between MA grant and fast access, but in any instance or in any event between that time, you would be covered. And then in case of a negative reimbursement decision, you would have, as a company, an obligation. You need to guarantee that your medicine remains accessible, that the patients will still have access to this medicine free of charge. And this would be, of course, for patients who already started on the treatment, no new patients, and until the end of the treatment. And of course, provided that your product is still therapeutically beneficial, because of course, if the DMA grant is rejected because it's not therapeutically beneficial, the patient would presumably also have no further need or use for that product. Now, what's important here is that compensation for this post negative reimbursement decision period would still be possible under the same conditions of the early access, and then for maximum 3 years. And here also the royal decree will have to provide more clarity on how this would happen and whether you need to apply for this compensation. So that brings me to fast access. It's fast access. The terms, in terms of slides and in terms of information, it's pretty similar to what I have discussed in respect of early access. And you see that the scheme is pretty similar. I think definitely point 2, 3, 4, and 5 are similar. The list of fast access medicines, well, there is a list, and this is very similar to the list of reimbursed medicines. So there would be a separate list for fast access medicines. I will discuss this in a moment. But of course, it's important to know here that it's not limited to the list of unmet medical needs. Your indication does not need to be included as an unmet medical need for it to be eligible, or your product to be eligible as fast access medicine. A lot of overlapping terms, so sometimes I will go a bit quicker here. So the list of fast access medicines will be determined by royal decree, same as the list of reimbursed medicines, and can be amended by the ministerial decree, same as the list of reimbursed medicines. Now, the minister can amend it on proposal of the advisory commission. So the advisory commission needs to propose this, and this proposal can be at its own initiative or can be requested by the Minister of Health or the company with the product concerned. And it can also be amended by, for instance, this can lead to including or deleting fast access medicines, or by amending some modalities in respect of these medicines. So as you see, this is a very similar flow to the procedure for reimbursed medicines. And that leads also to an entry into force of the amended list the first day of every month. Again, very similar to the list of reimbursed medicines. In principle, this would be the first day of the month after publication via the platform, or in the manner that is organized by the eHealth platform, which means if that's done on the 30th of March, you can still have it published, or it can still enter into force on the 1st of April. But if the modification would amount to a limitation of the patient's access, it would be on the first day of the month following some safety term, in particular 10 days waiting period after publication in the Belgian State Gazette. So that patients are aware. That's the underlying idea. We assume, because as I said before, we have proposed the bill, but the bill does not contain yet an explanatory memorandum. So we needed to interpret the clauses and read them in light of the present provisions to understand what they meant. Then inclusion in the list of fast access medicines. I've not stated application for fast access. Why? Because you have this automatic inclusion, as I said before, for early access medicines. And then you have also the possibility of an application for the prime and accelerated assessment under the EMA. When does you need to do this as a company? Well, you can do it already as from the CHMP's opinion until 1 month after the MA grant. So you can go a bit quicker than waiting for the MA, but after your MA is granted, you cannot wait too long. And this is really to cover the compensation for your product, the reimbursement for your product, prior to an actual reimbursement. And I think it can be an important tool for companies and for the patient and for the Belgian authorities as well. You see, again, a lot of this needs to be determined by royal decree. In terms of the application, it's very similar to what I said in respect of early access, apart from the fact that you do not need to apply for a marketing authorization within 6 months. You do not need to undertake that. Why? Because you already have a marketing authorization, and you therefore also do not need to communicate the CHMP's opinion as part of this. So apart from that, very similar obligations. And I think here the most important one is also that you need to apply for reimbursement within 6 months following a MA grant, because if you do not do so, and we'll discuss this in some of the next slides, you lose the fast access automatically. Then the decision on fast access, the assessment of your application will be done first, a motivated proposal by the advisory commission, and then a decision by the minister. Again, pretty similar with the reimbursement. Of course, there is the reimbursement commission. Here it's the EFEA advisory commission. A lot of this needs to be determined in a royal decree, but if there's no decision within a total of 90 days, then it's again considered as silent approval. That brings me to the compensation for fast access. It's a bit different from the early access because you don't have this two-tiered scheme. You only have the compensation, a fixed compensation per patient, not a fixed compensation for the approval of your file. And it would depend on the nature of the active ingredient, the size of the target population, and again, cannot be considered as indicative for reimbursement basis. If you, and this is important, I think, for fast access, you will get a compensation for the period before your reimbursement. After you obtain reimbursement and the reimbursement base would be higher or lower, there will be a settlement of the balance. It will be recalculated, and the idea is that your medicine would then be reimbursed and the balance would be settled as under fast access as if it would have been reimbursed under that new reimbursement base. So there's a settlement of the balance afterwards. It works with an advance based on fixed compensation. Now that settlement can be complete or it can be partial, can be a certain percentage. And in case of a negative decision, there's no need to restitute all the payments, the compensation that you have received in the meanwhile. Again, physician would need to file an application, compensation would then result from the general medicines budget here, and records need to be kept. And then the transition and the end of the fast access. Here it would end automatically if you do not apply, as I said before, within the 6 months for reimbursement, or if a reimbursement decision enters into force, because of course that supersedes then your fast access. The same again in terms of a negative reimbursement decision, you need to ensure that it still remains available for the patient, but the compensation under the fast access remains possible for a maximum of 3 years. So if we compare early access and fast access, you see the differences on this slide, all of which I have discussed already. Prior to MA grant, after MA grant, restricted to unmet medical needs, broader than only unmet medical needs. Key is the obligation to apply for a marketing authorization within 6 months. And then in terms of fast access, you need to apply for reimbursement within 6 months. The decision in terms of early access can be taken by the advisory commission, but in terms of fast access, it's the minister that needs to decide. The compensation is in terms of early access per approved file and per patient. In terms of fast access, only per patient. There's no settlement of the compensation upon reimbursement in terms of your early access compensation, but there would be a settlement of the balance of compensation upon reimbursement for fast access, and early access automatically leads to fast access upon a MA approval. And if we then look at the advisory commission, the responsibilities of the advisory commission are quite significant, I think, and the tasks and its competences. The list of unmet medical needs there it provides advice. In terms of early access, it takes all the decisions, inclusion of your product in early access, in compensation per case per patient, and then also a decision for payment and execution of that compensation decision. In terms of fast access, it's pretty similar, apart from the fact that the inclusion in fast access track is something for the minister to decide, as I said before. Now, we've seen that a lot of data has been collected, because that's one of your main obligations, have these data collected and then also analyze the pseudonymized version. Will be pseudonymized by the eHealth platform, the pseudonymized version of the collected data by the physician and the pharmacist. You as a company will need to analyze it, and you will need to also register and collect it for the following purposes: informing the institute, monitoring compliance with the reimbursement conditions, comparative evaluation of the medicine in terms of efficacy. So you see here, this is real world evidence. and assessing potential reimbursement in case of renewed early or fast access. What do they mean? Of course, they want to know, based on these data, whether you cannot already apply for reimbursement or for marketing authorization. And the advisory commission will determine which of these purposes are necessary, for which then data collection will be a reimbursement condition, can thus be a reimbursement condition. Then the collection, which data you are collected then and then analyzed, that's strictly what is necessary, limitation there, and the data access is also limited to the necessary people. The retention period here is to be further defined by royal decree. And that's, in a nutshell, early and fast and equitable access. And so I leave the floor to Bart for the last topic before coming back to you with some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirian. So we now move away from a very new topic towards a more traditional topic, which is managed entry agreements. And more specifically, we will talk about better use of these managed entry agreements and strengthening of the follow-up and transparency regarding this topic. First of all, there will be some changes regarding the situations that may trigger managed entry agreement negotiations in the current system, which you will see on the left part of the slide. There are 4 situations in which MEA negotiations can be triggered, and on the right side we see the proposed reform, which will reduce the amount of situations for triggering MEA negotiations to 3. So I will just focus on these 3 situations. The first one is if the CRM considers reimbursement basis proposed by the applicant to be disproportionate to the evaluated criteria, since it considers granting reimbursement entails budgetary and/or scientific uncertainties. You will notice that actually the 2 situations on the left hand of the slide have now been merged into one, because it says since it considers, whereas in the current system you have 2 separate provisions that trigger or can potentially trigger MEA negotiations, but the CRM will still have to propose the initiation of these negotiations to the minister. The second situation is if the CRM has formulated a negative reasoned proposal, then the minister will propose to start negotiations. If you compare it to the left hand or the left part of the slide, you will see that a certain passage has been deleted. It now just said if CRM has formulated a negative reasoned proposal, the passage that has been deleted or will be deleted is and the minister wishes to depart from the negative reasoned proposal but considers the proposed reimbursement basis to be disproportionate. That part would be dropped. And then the last situation that will trigger MEA negotiations is if the minister considers the proposed reimbursement basis to be disproportionate, and if the CRM gives a binding opinion that the proposed reimbursement entails budgetary and/or scientific uncertainties, then again the minister will propose to initiate MEA negotiations. Another important topic regarding MEAs is their expiry. So the draft bill now foresees that MEAs will end automatically on the first day of the month following the date that the medicine is no longer protected in Belgium by either a patent, a supplementary protection certificate, market exclusivity, or data exclusivity. And the draft bill also foresees that if at the end of the managed entry agreement, the medicine or the indication is not yet on the list of reimbursed pharmaceutical specialties, the applicants with a pharmaceutical firm must keep it available for a maximum period of 3 years for patients that already enjoyed reimbursement of this medicine or indication and that can still enjoy a therapeutic benefit from it. So that's important to keep in mind. Then another subtopic within the larger MEA topic is the tentative price post-MEA, and you will find this in Article 26 of the draft bill, which amends Article 35 bis, paragraph 7 of the Health Insurance Act. So there is this principle of the confidentiality of an annex to a managed entry agreement. You will find it in Article 35 bis, paragraph 7, subparagraph 3, but it will not apply to the determination of a tentative price post-agreement. Now, that specific term has not been defined in the draft bill, but if you read the synthesis table of the NEDI, which was annexed to the roadmap, you will see that this refers to the list price before the hypothesis of opening the reference cluster, which, if applicable, will lead to regulatory price reductions, both for the original drug and for the generic or biosimilar drug being reimbursed. Now, the ratio behind not having confidentiality for a tentative price post-agreement is that for medicines whose data exclusivity expires, generic and biosimilar manufacturers will receive the information on the indicative price post-agreement in timely and confidential manner. Again, as we have seen multiple times during the presentation, a royal decree will further determine modalities, deadlines, procedures, and conditions for establishing this indicative price post-agreement. So I'm guessing that we will see a definition, the end definition of this this term in the future royal decree. In any case, the synthesis table already talked about an NDA, so non-disclosure agreement procedure, in order to transfer the tentative price post-agreement to generic and or biosimilar manufacturers. And that's it already for me. I will now gladly cede the floor to Kirian, who will leave you with some concluding remarks regarding this interesting proposal for the reform of the reimbursement procedures in Belgium.
Excellent. Thank you, Bart. So that leaves us with some concluding remarks. I think many of the concluding remarks will not come as a surprise, at least that's the intention, if you conclude with some remarks after giving a presentation. It's, as we said before multiple times, it's a draft act, it's a bill, it's no law yet. So that means that there's still quite some uncertainty of what will come out. Of course, if the Council of Ministers has approved this draft act, and as many of you know who know Belgian legislation, their eventual act can be expected to be quite close to this draft act. So what we know is advice of the Council of State will be coming, parliamentary revision will be coming, and then implementation by royal decrees will be needed. I think after advice from the Council of State and the parliamentary revision, I think we will still be quite close to the present bill. What is, of course, very important is what will be determined next in these royal decrees. And that's just because, as you've seen throughout the slides, a lot of this has been delegated to the king, in other words, to the government to further implement. But the conclusions based on this draft bill can therefore be already as follows. I think, firstly, when you've read the roadmap and you now see the proposal, I think you will realize, just like we did, that a lot of this roadmap has been implemented into the law. So you see that the legislator, at least the government, wants to stick to what it has envisaged in the roadmap, to what the INAMI has also envisaged in the roadmap. Some aspects have not yet been included, but can be included in other acts or in the royal decrees, so we will need to see. The main focus on the reform, at least in this bill, is the early and fast access to medicines. I see that there's a typo in the slides, which we will correct before sending you. I saw a typo before as well. But this early and fast access to medicines is, I think, new, and what at least particularly the fast access, I think the idea is really to bring added value and to allow companies to profit from the time in between in terms of bringing their product already to the market, having patients benefit from it. And that's, I think, an interesting route which we will need to explore, and which, of course, we will see in the next coming years whether or not it's sufficiently balanced for all stakeholders involved. Then there's the increased involvement of patient organizations. I think it's at the same time subtle, but also rather new. Including their involvement even as advisory or with an advisory voice in the Reimbursement Commission and the EFEA Advisory Commission. Then there's the first steps of the MEA reform, where I think it's important that there's this underlying requirement of patent or regulatory protection, meaning exclusivity for your product. And then there's also the increased relevance of real-world evidence, and I think that was something the stakeholders, the Belgian state, the INAMI, considered to be necessary in this 21st century, sorry. And then, so I think that brings us to a lot of these new elements which are part of the draft bill and which will further be implemented by the Royal Decree. Now, our idea here and our, let's say, continuous effort is always to keep you up to date. And it's to keep you up to date of these types of reforms before perhaps others do, and also to keep you up to date of further developments in respect of this particular reform. We will discuss when there is further information also in the eventual draft act that is discussed in the Parliament, perhaps also information from the Council of State. We will discuss it in our formula seminar. In our formula seminar, we will of course also discuss some other topics. Where we, as usual, we provide you with, let's say, a pizza slice overview of the last year, all developments in respect of medicinal products, which are, in our view, essential to your company and where you will be brought up to speed. We have somebody of the European Commission talking on supplementary protection certificates and their proposed reform. We will have somebody from the companies, pharmaceutical company, coming to talk about loss of exclusivity and practical guidance in this regard. And we will definitely add a further topic, which, depending on what comes out in the next months, will be the most relevant at that point in time. So please join us for our formula seminar on the 19th of April, 2024. It's in the afternoon, it's a Friday. Note, this is only in person, it's not hybrid, it's not online. So we hope to see you here, have a nice lunch together and have some after drinks also together. But for today, thank you for attending this webinar and see you at the next occasion. Thank you very much. Thank you also for the support here from a technical perspective and Bart for his excellent presentation.